The fantasy season's over for 2024, but the Dynasty grind never stops. Today, we take you through the 2025 Dynasty quarterback rankings to get you ready for another charge at that Dynasty title on the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. And Dynasty season is very much here. We're going to be going through all four of the main Dynasty positions. For today, we are talking quarterbacks. Fantasy Pros just announced that I was once again named the most accurate quarterback ranker in the world this year. So felt like a pretty good place to start. So just keep in mind with any Dynasty rankings, there are a couple of things to keep in mind. Firstly, you need to consider where you're at in your team's life cycle. Are you competing right away? Are you rebuilding? Are you somewhere in the middle? Or are you in a position where you can compete, but also make sure you're rebuilding at the same time? I tend to aim for the middle here, but it is pretty difficult. There are certain players, for example, that would be ranked very high if you are in a currently competing situation, and other players that would be ranked significantly lower there, and vice versa. If you're currently rebuilding, obviously you don't want some of those older guys. You want the guys that can help you challenge now. So just keep that in mind. And if you ever have any questions, you can hit me up in the comments, or you can, of course, message me on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down, on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. Plus, it would be great if you'd like and subscribe on YouTube. The full rankings will be up very soon at ffdfantasyfootball.com as well. But let's talk quarterbacks. And as always, we're going with a graphic just to make it a little bit more visually easy to follow. Now, keep in mind, of course, that these will change as the off-season goes on. There's a heap of news that's going to come out about players re-signing. Plenty of these guys are free agents. Plenty of these guys will sign new contracts. And all of those things are going to make a difference. So just keep that in mind when you are going through and sorting out all of your Dynasty stuff. Asking questions, very much encouraged. I do want to help you out and make sure that you guys have the best Dynasty teams you can. Okay, let's start things off at the top. And we start with Josh Allen, who remains my quarterback one. He had his fifth straight top two fantasy season. He hasn't missed more than one game in a season since his rookie season back in 2018. He's only 29 years old. His rushing will eventually slow down, but he's still gone over 500 yards in each of the last four seasons. He's got the arm strength and the accuracy with only 6 intercepts last season to be able to continue producing well into the future, unlike these other pure rushing quarterbacks who are going to be very limited as they age. Think someone like a Cam Newton, for example. You're not going to get that sort of regression with someone like Josh Allen. He will certainly fall off a little bit as his rushing floor disappears, but there hasn't been any signs of that happening in the near future, so he remains my number one. After that gets pretty close with these next five, and I have tossed up having them in different orders, but I had to put Joe Burrow as number two because I think his production is more sustainable than most of the others. Once again, 29 years old, so he's got plenty of time left over. He could easily play for another 10 years with good production. He's got 3 top 5 seasons in the last 4 seasons. Obviously had that major dud where he was injured and just really struggled in 2023, but he looked fantastic, especially towards the end of this season. Could potentially be hurt by T. Higgins leaving. That could create some issues. If he re-signs, then that'll really help. If he signs elsewhere, then Burrow might drop a little bit, but he's still got that arm strength. He's still got Jamar Chase, still an aggressive offense. He's someone I'm very happy to have in my Dynasty team. And in fact, I do have him in my main home Dynasty team. Jaden Daniels is my number 3. I was really high on Jaden Daniels last season. A lot of people were not happy with my take on that. I think that's really bared out. Even before the NFL draft, I argued that Daniels was my favorite fantasy prospect because he's got that rushing floor that had him go for nearly 900 yards last season. He ended up as the QB4. It's unsurprising he's very high. The reason he's not higher is a couple of things. Firstly, slightly older for a rookie. He's now 25 already. But secondly, that rushing floor is going to fall off at some stage. And while he's a good quarterback, he's not an elite quarterback without his legs. His legs really do a lot of the heavy lifting. And without that, it's hard to see him producing consistently. So he's the kind of guy that you want to ride out for the next 5 to 6 years. But you've got to understand, if you're doing a full rebuild, he is someone that you can probably sell high on. You can probably get some other guys that are going to give you more long-term possibilities. Now, he is still only going through his rookie season, so it's hard to see that fall off happening anytime soon. But if you were just starting a rebuild, he's probably someone that you can sell very high right now for a team that's thinking about challenging into the future. Patrick Mahomes, number 4, really hard to rank him at the moment. They had that terrible season realistically, and it wasn't great last year either. And yet they were still winning. And it makes you think, well, if they can do that and win without him playing particularly well from a fantasy perspective, I mean, why would they change anything? I think we will see transition away from the tight end heavy Travis Kelce focus that we've seen for so many years. And hopefully they don't turn towards a rushing attack, because that would really hurt Mahomes. Talking about a guy who was the QB1 in 2022 and since then has been number 7 and number 10 while only missing one game each season. That's not very good. So that is the concern there. Having said that, even though he's 30 years old, he has not only the arm talent, but also just the general skill set to keep playing well at a high level for an extended period of time. But his ceiling is significantly lower than it was a couple of years ago. I do think getting Rashee Rice back next season might help. Obviously, he was meant to have Marquise Brown, Hollywood Brown, and he didn't either. So the fact they had to go out and get Hopkins wasn't exactly ideal. I think that really limited them. Worthy started to establish himself later on the season as well. I do think we'll see the passing game be a little bit better next season, but he does still have a lower floor. I think if you're a win now team, I would have Mahomes closer to like the QB6, but because he's got that longevity, I rank him high in general in Dynasty. Jalen Hurts, one of those guys that's really hurt long-term by the fact that his legs will slowly fade. We're talking about a guy who is 27, even though he realistically has only been playing consistently since 2021. For that reason, you've got to worry that he's going to hit that cliff in the next 3 or 4 seasons or something like that. So if you're in a rebuild, this is a guy you probably want to sell high on. He has consistently been pretty good, but this season he did drop off a little bit, wasn't getting enough passing touchdowns, definitely lowered the intercepts, which really helped. They obviously had some injuries to guys like AJ Brown, Devonta Smith, Dallas Goedert. That obviously hurt as well. But I think the biggest thing that hurt him this season is that Saquon Barkley was excellent. And Barkley's not going to be around forever, but while he's got Barkley, Hurts is going to struggle to consistently produce. So for that reason, in a win-now situation as well, it's hard to rank him particularly high. I think even if you're just thinking right now, he's probably only the QB5 for me, because Jackson goes past him and Mahomes goes the other way. I do think he has a little bit more longevity to him than a Lamar Jackson, but it is hard to feel very good about him in the ultra long term as well, because of how much of his production comes from rushing touchdowns. He's had double-digit rushing touchdowns each of the last 4 seasons. He's had over 600 rushing yards each of the last 4 seasons. That's not going to keep happening as he gets into his 30s, though that is still a couple of years away. Lamar Jackson is my number 6, still only 28 years old, which is positive. Really relies on his legs, has been over 750 rushing yards each of the last 6 seasons. This season nearly went over 1,000 even, but very few rushing touchdowns, which is really interesting. I think Derrick Henry has an impact on that, but the offense did look really good this year. Jumped up to 41 passing touchdowns and only 4 interceptions. Compare that to the previous 2 seasons where he went 24-7 and 17-7. Those 41 passing touchdowns, you got to wonder, is there some regression in there? They really upped the amount of passing yards, the amount of passing touchdowns. Why did that happen? Well, partly the defense really struggled. The defense really regressed this year, and they really had to attack. That's not typical Ravens play. I do think potentially we will see some regression there in those passing numbers, because they shouldn't need to pass that much to stay in the game. They should be able to rely on their defense a little bit more effectively. Secondly, he is going to age. He can't keep rushing for nearly 1,000 yards every season, and that's going to massively hurt his fantasy production. So even though it was the QB1 this year, it was a pretty fluky year. There were no injuries. He had a lot of passing touchdowns. He rushed a lot. All of that came together, but that does have a lot of flukiness. You cannot rely on that. So as a long-term prospect, I like him below all of these guys. All of those top 5, that is. But in the short term, obviously, if you're thinking just in the next 2 to 3 seasons, probably the QB2 realistically behind Josh Allen for me. You could even argue that in redraft, you might even rank him number 1, though I do think Allen has a little bit of a better floor. Caleb Williams, I was pretty high on Caleb Williams last season, and even though he disappointed, he started to get better as the season goes on. I still think there's the talent here. Rushed for nearly 500 yards, which is positive. Only 6 interceptions is good. There just weren't the passing touchdowns there. Keenan Allen wasn't consistently healthy and playing well. They weren't able to get the offense going. They need to change a lot of things in Chicago. But the quarterback is not one of them. I do think Williams is good enough. I still think Jaden Daniels is a little bit better as a fantasy prospect, but I do think that Williams is the guy there. And he is the quarterback I want to have for fantasy moving forward. Below those top 6 studs, I think he's the one below those guys that you can feel really good about as a fantasy prospect long term. CJ Stroud had a very disappointing season last season, but he is still young, still realistically actually the same age as Caleb Williams at the moment. So despite his regression in his performance, he had 12 interceptions compared to 5. And also in his fantasy stats, he went from 13th QB to 18th despite playing more games. I do think we're talking about a guy who can still consistently produce. They did really lean on Joe Mixon at times. I don't think that's really sustainable. I think they do need to get him passing a little bit better. They need Nico Collins healthy all season. They need Stephon Diggs or whoever replaces him healthy all season. Tank Dell's obviously a big loss too. They basically just need to refresh all of their receivers and get Stroud playing a little bit better. I do think he has the upside, but it is hard to feel great about him. For me, there's a massive gap between Jackson and Stroud. It's hard to know exactly where Williams goes in there, but for me, he's closer to Stroud than he is to Jackson. Kyler Murray, controversial at number 9. I posted these rankings on my Instagram page, and I definitely got some feedback about Kyler, and I get it. I do understand, but we are talking about a guy who has pretty consistently produced when he's been healthy. I don't see any reason to think that's going to change. They're kind of stuck with him for a couple of seasons. He does have a very, very high cap hit, and that's going to occur whether he's on the team or not. He has played okay. Like, he's played fine. Nearly 4,000 passing yards, 21 passing touchdowns, 11 interceptions isn't great. But you've got to realize he was rusty from that big injury last year. I think he will be better in his second year back. Nearly rushed for 600 yards and plenty of rushing touchdowns too. I think he's still got production ahead of him. I think that you can still feel pretty good about him moving forward because he's only 28 years old. The size is obviously always going to be an issue. They do need a stronger O-line to make that work. They seem to have very good rushing, but their protection is not very good, and that could be an issue, and that's going to cause potential injuries moving forward. So I don't feel great about having Murray here, but again, there's no one else I feel particularly good about putting ahead of him either. Justin Herbert is my number 10. That's a jump from last year. I did expect a heavier ground game out of the Chargers. That didn't really happen as much as we expected. They ended up passing the ball a lot more than we thought they would. And Herbert was sensational. Just 3 interceptions in the season is pretty spectacular. Plus, he rushed more than he ever has. He had 306 rushing yards, which is a career high. Passing numbers were lower than they were when he first got out. He's never going to be that QB2 again like he was in 2021, but he's still a good, solid option. He finishes the QB13, but I think we saw that they used him in the passing game more later on the season. I think that will continue to happen. Ladd McConkey started to emerge. Quentin Johnston started to look better. It wouldn't surprise me if they replaced Joshua Palmer with someone. Herbert obviously is still pretty young. He's only 27, so I would be expecting a lot of positives out of Herbert moving forward. He's someone you can feel solid about in fantasy, though if you're in just a 4-point passing touchdown league, he does have less upside because he doesn't have those legs that some of the QBs below him have. I like Drake May quite a bit going into last season. A lot of people weren't high on him, but it was easy to get a little bit caught up in the Caleb Williams and Jaden Daniels of it all. It is good to remember that Drake May would have been the number 1 quarterback in pretty much any other season. Next year would have been number 1 last year. The year before last year, so 2023 would have been number 1. 2022, number 1. Like, we're talking about a guy who just happened to get a little bit unlucky about what year he came out. Very talented quarterback, great for fantasy. I feel like we're talking about a guy who's going to be excellent for years moving forward. Obviously still only 23, coming off his rookie season. Lots of growth potential, too many interceptions, but realistically, New England sucked. In 13 games, he managed to rush 400 yards. That's only going to go up with more games. More passing touchdowns will happen if they actually give him someone to pass the ball to. Cannot just be Hunter Henry and Austin Hooper all day and lots of random wide receivers that were terrible coming into this year and hence were presumably terrible this year as well. They need to give him some actual weapons and he will produce moving forward. The question is, When is that going to happen? I don't know, but he's definitely got the talent. I do think bringing someone in like Mike Vrabel, who actually knows what he's talking about, is going to make a massive difference. We saw him do a very good job in Tennessee. I do think that May is going to be great moving forward. Is he ever going to be a top quarterback? Well, that'll depend on what scheme he ends up in. I would think it's going to be slightly defensive, passive scheme, and for that reason, I can't put him higher than this. But I do think we're talking about a talented quarterback who isn't going anywhere for the next 10 years. I've been slated for this one a little bit. Bo Nix down at 12, even though he was the QB9 this year. The reason is I don't actually think he's very good. Obviously, he's already 25 years old as well, so he's coming out with a lot more experience. So you'd expect him to hit the ground running. Definitely threw a lot of touchdowns later in the season as they conceded points. They absolutely needed to, but also started to throw a lot of interception as they aired it out more. Obviously had 3 interceptions against the Colts, 2 interceptions against Cleveland, 1 against the Bengals. They're all terrible pass defenses. He was not coming up against good pass defenses down the stretch. He was throwing a heap of interceptions. In fact, he had a really good schedule this year. And while he did turn it into a good fantasy result, those 430 rushing yards really helped. And he did have a lot of passing touchdowns, nearly 30. I don't know. I just don't think the talent's really there. I don't actually think he's as good as most people think. I think he will fade relatively quickly. He'll hang around, but I don't think we're talking about a guy who's going to be a consistent fantasy producer for years to come. I think the other guys have more upside and arguably a better floor. So for that reason, Nix is a little bit lower. I do acknowledge, though, that I might be wrong. And for that reason, I didn't rank him too low. I actually would like to rank him lower. I think he probably will be lower, but I do acknowledge the fact that it is entirely possible I'm wrong here, so I'm not going to rank him lower than I feel safe doing. Anthony Richardson, another guy I don't feel particularly good about, but we do have to remember he is young, certainly 23, which is younger than Caleb Williams. Very, very, very little experience. So only 15 NFL games in his first 2 seasons and didn't even play all of some of those. Obviously only had, a dozen college games. So he's really only played like 27 games of professional football and he hasn't played them very well. Didn't go over 2,000 passing yards this year, had 8 passing touchdowns and 12 interceptions, along with 6 rushing touchdowns. Nearly 500 rushing yards on the ground is why you have Richardson. That upside is why I'm willing to have him in my team, but I do not feel confident that he will ever be an NFL quarterback. I've felt this way for a long time. I've been saying this for a long time. I got slated at the start of the 2023 season when I ranked him really, really low because I did not feel confident in his talent or his ability to produce. I still don't feel good about that. I really don't think we're talking about a guy here who's going to be a consistent producer. He might turn into a bursty Cam Newton potentially, but I feel like you're more likely to be someone like Tyrod Taylor, that sort of situation. It just feels to me like he's never really going to be a true starting quarterback. I know he's got a big arm, but I just don't think the talent is truly there. I don't think we've seen it from him, and there's no reason to believe we will going into this season. The Colts had plenty of fine producers. There's no reason they should have been as poor as they were. Plus, you got Jonathan Taylor, who's such a massive distraction, and yet he's still got a completion percentage below 50%. That's really terrible. Jared Goff, obviously, he's aging now, but he's playing really well into his 30s, but still only 31. And that's pretty young for a guy that is entering his 10th season. Has looked excellent the last couple of seasons with the Lions. It looked like potentially last season might have been a fluke, but realistically, he's been top 10 the last 3 years. Does like the ceiling of some other guys, but it's hard to argue with a guy who threw 37 passing touchdowns, even when they're relying on the run so much. And it's hard to see the Lions fading away anytime in the near future. They do look legitimately really good at the moment. So I think you could argue that Goff could be higher if you are not even close to a rebuild. If you're just competing right now, Goff is a great weapon to use. The problem is that he does at times get found out. He does have those very poor games, and that can really help him. Obviously, he threw 5 interceptions against the Texans of all people, and they've got a very weak passing defense. But he only threw 7 interceptions in the other 16 games. So he really didn't have that bad a season. Lots of potential there to just produce consistently as a top 10 guy because you know that he stays healthy most of the time, because you know that his role is pretty set and it's a really good offense. That lack of rushing floor does hurt, though, especially in a 4-point passing touchdown league. Baker Mayfield had a fantastic season. He looked really good for the Bucs. Top 5 fantasy finish as well. Over 40 passing touchdowns. Did have 16 interceptions, which is literally 1 per game, and that's not good. But when you're throwing for 4,500 yards, that's going to happen. A lot of those interceptions did happen in a burst in the middle of the season. From week 6 to 8, he threw 7 interceptions, which isn't great. But he also threw a lot towards the end of the season. He also threw 7 interceptions in the last 6 games combined. So he was pretty bursty. And a lot of those were against poor defenses. So you do have to worry about that a little bit. Did have by far his most rushing yards of his career. He's never had more than 165. This year he had well over double that, 378 rushing yards. So he is producing that way as well. That really helps. Did it without Chris Godwin as well. McMillan looked good. Mike Evans was injured for part of the season. So producing that well without your best receivers is good, assuming you're expecting to have good receivers later in the season as well. So for a guy who's only 30, definitely a solid fantasy option. Trevor Lawrence, hard to feel very good about him when the defense has sucked so much and he's had to pass, and yet he hasn't been able to produce from a fantasy perspective. The injury really doesn't help. It's hard to feel good about anyone that's got a shoulder issue because it's so important for quarterbacks. Also not ideal that he only threw 11 passing touchdowns in 10 games, and yet he had 7 interceptions. That's not very good at all. He also really dropped from a rushing perspective, so hard to feel great about Lawrence at the moment. He's only 26, so there is time for him to turn it around, but I don't have a great deal of confidence in him. For that reason, I've ranked him a little bit lower, but the upside's clearly there. Dak Prescott, I've liked for a long time. He's very up and down from a fantasy perspective. He was the QB3 in 2019, and then he got injured and missed most of the next season. He was the QB4 in 2023, and then he got injured and missed most of the next season. And in both those situations, didn't play very well before his injury. In fact, in 2024, he had 11 passing touchdowns and 8 interceptions. That's terrible. Plus, his rushing floor dropped as well. He is also 32, so he is aging, and that rushing floor is going to continue to drop. But when you're throwing 2 interceptions in 4 different games of the season, it's hard to feel very good about someone for fantasy. He only had 1 top 10 fantasy performance this season in those 8 games. So very hard to feel good about Dak. But look at who he was throwing to. He had CeeDee Lamb, and I mean, that's literally it. He had CeeDee Lamb. So they do need to make some changes there. They do need to make some massive improvements. Hopefully that happens over the offseason, or Dak's going to be someone who's not very productive for fantasy. Jordan Love, I mean, realistically, I know he's down at 18, but he's actually not that far away from Bo Nix, for example. I don't feel great about his talent. It's not so much the interceptions, though he has had 11 in each of the last 2 seasons. It's just the way they play. They don't pass the ball unless they absolutely need to. I don't see a coaching change anytime in the near future. Plus, I just don't think he actually has a lot of arm talent. I think he's just a bit of a system quarterback. He's also already 27, and he's only played 2 full seasons. That's pretty old for a guy with that little experience. I feel like he's getting found out. I feel like he's not going to last particularly long. I feel like they're going to realize that if they're going to actually win a Super Bowl, they probably need a better quarterback. And he has, a couple of years left on his contract because they did re-sign him. I don't know. I feel like 2 or 3 years down the road, we're going to be talking about Jordan Love as a backup, or he's not going to be a Packer, and then he's really going to struggle. So for that reason, in fantasy, I've got him lower. He's never been a great fantasy asset, though at least in 2023 he was the QB5. That was a little bit fluky. This season, he definitely got found out more. Brock Purdy, another guy, very much a system quarterback. Has produced from a fantasy perspective the last couple of seasons, but that's mainly been down to his ability to stay healthy. Definitely upped his rushing yards, 323 rushing yards this season, had 144 the season before. But that's led to his passing yards dropping, his touchdowns dropping, more interceptions. I mean, he's not that good. He's solid, but he's very much a system quarterback. And we saw what happened when the system started to fall down. He didn't have the pieces around him. Now, to be fair, maybe he didn't produce because he didn't have the pieces around him, and that's a totally valid argument, and I can definitely see that argument. But when you consider how much talent is around him, you have to consider that potentially he might only be producing because of that talent, because when the talent isn't there, he doesn't look very good. Still only 26 years old, so there's definitely potential he'll get better, but I don't feel very confident in him for that reason. Tua Tagovailoa, I think, is a far better quarterback than a Purdy or a Love, for example. But there's just so much injury risk. There's always a risk of a concussion or something else. He was fantastic this season, though. Like over 70% completion percentage. Didn't play a full season like he did last season, obviously, and that really hurt the Dolphins. But he was better. 19 touchdowns, only 7 interceptions. That's still not fantastic numbers, but it's good. Never been much of a rusher, and realistically, that's probably for the best. But such a talented quarterback. I really do like him. And he seems like a really nice guy as well. Only 27, so definitely potential for him to play a lot longer, but his health is always going to be the issue there, and it's hard to feel good about him for that reason. If he's your backup or something like that, though, I like him as an option that's for a backup. I do feel like he's going to produce fine, assuming he can stay healthy. Found it really hard to rank Sam Darnold because we don't really know what's happening with him. I mean, he's a free agent, and JJ McCarthy will probably be Minnesota's quarterback next season. It is possible they bring Darnold back the first couple of games until McCarthy's ready, but I don't know. Darnold did seem to really struggle down the stretch, and while the protection was terrible, he didn't look great against the Rams, and that was a game they definitely should have been winning. Has thrown too many interceptions, including a couple of really dud games, threw 3 interceptions against Jacksonville, which is wacky, and 2 against the Colts. Did have some solid games, but even in wins against the good teams, the likes of Detroit, for example, or in games against Detroit, he didn't do very much. Like, he threw for okay yardage, but 1 passing touchdown. I mean, realistically, excuse me, I don't know. I think he's been solid. 35 passing touchdowns is impressive, but you've got Justin Jefferson, you've got Jordan Addison, Aaron Jones is really underrated. TJ Hawkinson's very good. The weapons are there to make any quarterback look pretty solid. I worry he's going to go to another team and he's going to be average, so that's why I can't rank him any higher than that. I'm also worth remembering he's not young anymore. Like, we're not talking about a guy who is like coming straight out of college anymore. He's definitely aging. He's played, 7 seasons now. So we're talking about a guy who's heading into that Jared Goff range of being more of a veteran. Michael Penix finally got some chances toward the end of the season. He looks fine, I guess. But remember, Kirk Cousins didn't look great either. The problem is Penix isn't going anywhere. He is going to be at the Falcons. So this is kind of what you're going to get out of Michael Penix. They're going to run the ball a lot because Bijan Robinson is ridiculous. They've got some good passing weapons. They've got guys like Drake London and Kyle Pitts, and they don't use them particularly effective because Pitts is such a bad pass protector that they can't have him in there when they're probably rushing the ball. So for that reason, you end up underusing him. London kind of gets a lot of double coverage, and so you might have Mooney back. It's just an awkward situation for Penix. I don't love it. He's already 25 and he's played 5 games. I just don't think the talent's there of the other guys who are rookies this season. So that's why Penix is a little bit lower than most. Also note, by the way, there's no actual rookies from the coming season as well. I don't think we have a good enough feel yet of where they're going and how high they're going to go. I think probably Sanders and Cam Ward are the only ones that will even be top 30 guys for me, and they're probably not going to be above any of the guys I've mentioned here. Bryce Young really bounced back towards the end of the season, ended up with 15 touchdowns and 9 interceptions. But worth noting, a lot of those interceptions happened early in the season before he was dropped. Late in the season, he went 10-0 in his last 3 games, really started to look very good. Also had 6 rushing touchdowns after having none in his first season. He just generally looked better. He looks like a better quarterback, and that's great. And it's not like they gave him better weapons, because they absolutely didn't. But he still looks very, very solid. Had a great connection with Adam Thielen. Xavier Liggett starting to look a lot better, made use of Coca. I mean, there's not a lot of talent there. If they're bringing some proper talent, I feel like you're going to see a lot more production out of Young as Liggett starts to develop and that offense generally gets better. So talking about a guy who's only 24, same age as Caleb Williams, but with a lot more experience. He was a waste of a number 1 pick and all that they traded away from him. But as a fantasy prospect, he's still okay. JJ McCarthy, the first guy on this list that hasn't played an NFL game. I don't know exactly how to feel about this, but I feel like he's probably the Vikings quarterback next year. And assuming he starts, I mean, we've seen how productive that can be. The problem is, I don't think he's very good. I didn't like him a lot coming out of college. It felt like a reach to me. I don't think he played particularly well in college. I feel like he was more of a system quarterback. We do know that this is kind of a system quarterback situation where they've got so much weapons around him and the play calling will support him. But I don't think it's as safe as a Brock Purdy situation. I think he's still going to need to show some talent, and I don't know that he has it. So that's why I've got him relatively low, even though he's young and he's in a good situation, only 22. I do feel like potentially there is some risk there with McCarthy. Matthew Stafford, look, really talented quarterback. Love Matthew Stafford. Amazing player. Talking about a guy who played in the 2000s, like that's absolutely ridiculous because he came out in 2009. So going into what is 16th, 17th NFL season, but he's no longer a fantasy producer. 2021, he was the QB6. Since then, he hasn't been higher than QB15. You're not talking about a guy who's going to consistently do much for you. They run the ball a lot. They don't really need him to do too much unless they're really going for the game. And he hasn't been able to. So hard to feel great about Stafford. Obviously, he's also aging as well. He's 37 now, so he's only got a couple of years in him at best. But he'll produce okay for you if you need him. Same deal with Russell Wilson, obviously. Wilson, now a free agent. Does he go back? I don't know. All three of their quarterbacks at Pittsburgh are free agents. I feel like it's highly possible we see Wilson re-sign, talking about an experienced quarterback, but he hasn't produced for fantasy in quite some time. He hasn't stayed healthy for a whole season in quite some time. Hard to feel particularly good about him when you don't even know whether he's going to be playing and who he will be playing for if he plays. Geno Smith, unsurprisingly, had a big drop back to earth after that QB6 finish in 2022. Who saw that coming? Literally everybody who was paying attention. Couple of average seasons, so many weapons. You've got DK Metcalf, you've got Tyler Lockett, who admittedly is aging out a little bit. He's 33 ridiculously. And then Jackson Smith-Njigba emerges, plus Noah Fant's pretty good, and you've got a great run game. I mean, you just need a functional quarterback, and Geno Smith was that functional quarterback. They looked okay, but he's not very good for fantasy. So for that reason, talking about a guy who's 35 years old, I mean, what are you going to get out of him? His ceiling is what he's been producing the last season or two. Can't feel great about him. Derek Carr, again, just can't really seem to stay healthy. He's 34 now. Look, they can't easily get rid of him. I believe this season it will be paid $50 million, but it will realistically only cost them 25 to get rid of him. Wouldn't surprise me if they do that. They don't really have a high enough pick to bring someone in, but they could bring in someone else. I don't know. I don't know that they can really trust Carr anymore. If they keep him around, I mean, he is what he is. He doesn't rush a lot. They run the ball a lot if he stays in New Orleans. He's never going to be a great fantasy producer. I mean, he never really has been. He has literally one top 11 finish in his career, and that was QB8, and that was in 2016. So that's just what you're getting out of Derek Carr. Aaron Rodgers, I mean, look, this whole Jets thing's been really, really disappointing. Does not help when you're injured, but he's 42. I mean, what did we expect? I know Tom Brady broke the mold, but Aaron Rodgers, no offense, not Tom Brady. QB17 was probably nearly a ceiling last season. It did help they went and got Devontae Adams. Nearly 4,000 yards. 28 and 11 is actually pretty good, but I don't know, the team just looked generally awful anyway. We don't know if he's coming back, and that's why he's so low for me. I actually, if he does come back, on a per-season basis, I'll have him above Carr, above Smith, above Wilson, certainly, maybe above Stafford, because he at least has that upside, especially if they keep Adams, but it's hard to see him coming back. They did look pretty poor last season. It depends who they bring in, I guess. And finally, Aiden O'Connell, I don't feel particularly good about putting him here. I don't feel good about putting anyone here. But, I mean, look at that. Think about that moustache. I mean, how can you say no to that? I think probably he does stay with the Raiders. They do feel like they're in a bit of a rebuild. He was functional at times during the season when he was able to stay healthy. But, I mean, he's not going anywhere. He's like 27 years old, whatever. Like, there's nothing exciting there. I don't feel great about him. Other guys that were around this range, I mean, Justin Fields at least will produce if he can get a starting role, but he probably won't. Same thing with the Daniel Jones. Kirk Cousins probably a backup now. Deshaun Watson's obviously injured again. Spencer Rattler, I don't think he's going to get that starting role over Carr. The Tennessee guys, who knows what's going on there. Someone like a Gardner Minshew or a Mac Jones or a Jameis Winston produced at times, but they're not getting a starting role. I think those top 29 guys will probably be starters next season, and then I'd say you probably get the rookies in. I think Sanders probably starts. I think Ward probably starts. Maybe one other. We'll have to see if someone like a Ewers, for example, does, but I don't think he will. So it'll just be someone else. I think probably O'Connell is the most likely, but we'll see what happens. Outside those top 29, I don't feel good about anyone in fantasy, but if you're playing in a particularly deep league and you've got questions, hit me up. Happy to help you out. And that's all we've got for our Dynasty quarterback rankings for this early in the season. Obviously, I will do an update closer to the draft and then a heap on this after the NFL draft as well. We'll also be talking about NFL draft coming up as well, but it's running back rankings next. So in the coming days, I will be back to talk about all things running backs. If you like this, please hit us up, give us a like, give us a follow, and also pop those questions below in the comments. You can also hit us up on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down and on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. I look forward to chatting to you guys next time.